Hey, this is Russell Moore, and this is Reading in Exile, where we go through the library and pull out books to talk about. One of you asked me about a particular guy that I read a lot and cite a lot and quote a lot. And I happened to be thinking about him when you mentioned him because, as I mentioned before, uh, I normally have to have my hair cut every 2 weeks at the most. We're trying to make do. Maria is cutting it, but I've actually thought about, should I just shave it all off and just be completely Lex Luthor bald? And my son Samuel's nodding his head yes now as he records, but I don't think I'm going to do that. But it reminded me of one of my favorite bald guys, and that's a leadership guru by the name of Seth Godin. And I've pulled out some of his books. I read everything that he writes, and I have most of what he writes here. But these are my four favorites, and they're where I would say you should start. And they're usually short, quick reads. This one is called The Dip. I have recommended this and given it to so many people, especially people who are in Christian ministry, but it applies to anything. Godin's not a Christian believer, but he writes about some principles here that I think are really applicable to Christians. The dip that he's talking about here is the understanding that you start something because that's where your giftedness is, and there's going to come a point where there's going to be a kind of a resistance, a dip in what's taking place. And he cites a book that also has been really beneficial to me called The War of Art, which talks about a resistance that when you're starting to do something, there's going to be a kind of fear, there's going to be a kind of maybe even just internal, a sort of backlash that's going to keep you from doing that. And so, think about if you're somebody who writes, or if you're somebody who's trying to prepare something creative, what do you normally do? You normally try to find a way to distract yourself from doing that. And what Godin is saying here is, first of all, that's fear coming in. Secondly, it's the fact that when you're doing something that is innovative, that actually is bringing a contribution, there's going to be that trough. And that's what actually separates out people who are successful from people who are not. The people who don't ultimately end up succeeding are the people who, when they hit that dip, they quit. And so I think about a lot. There's a guy called me one time, had this conversation, I don't know how many times, he was pastor of a church, and he came in, and at first everyone was glad he was there. He started reaching a lot of people in that community for Christ. The church started changing, and he had some disgruntled people in the congregation, and he was really discouraged, and he wanted to leave. And I discouraged him from leaving. I said, you ought to stay. Most of the people are with you. Well, what happens? He lives through that dip, and then ultimately he sees the thriving and the flourishing of his ministry. Well, that's what this book is about. It sort of helps you to know how to know if you're in a dip, or how to know if you're just doing something you shouldn't be doing and you don't have the giftedness to do that. It's really, really helpful. Another book that's really helpful is Tribes. And what this book essentially is about is the understanding that sometimes people think that they're going to be able to reach everybody. And what Godin says is, if you're speaking to, or no matter what you're doing, if you're speaking to or you're addressing everybody, then you're not going to be able to address anybody. And so instead, what has to happen is there has to be a speaking to a tribe, to the particular, and through that to then be able to bring a contribution and to reach and to bring something to the world. And so if you think about it in terms of Godin will talk often about the Grateful Dead. And the Grateful Dead is a really niche sort of music. It's not the sort of music that played on the radio, on sort of your normal top 40 sort of pop music show. But what happens is the Grateful Dead did something unique They spoke to a particular audience who resonated with them. And so you had the phenomena of the deadheads going all around the country. And we remember the Grateful Dead in a way that we don't remember your sort of standard issue pop 40 people. What Godin's argument is that in this sort of economy, what we have right now, where people aren't watching the same three television networks all the time, this is a Grateful Dead economy, not something that is more generic and not speaking to anybody. And also, he talks about in several of these books about if you go to an Amazon page, for instance, and you look at the reviews of indisputably great works, Moby Dick, say by Herman Melville, what you will find is there are one-star reviews. I was bored with all this about the whale. That sort of thing. So what he's saying is, notice this, when you see that, what you don't say is, well, Herman Melville's a failure. What you say is, these are people who don't get Moby Dick. And he says there are going to be a lot of things that you're going to do where people aren't going to get it. And that's fine because it's not for them. And so he talks about in Tribes things like, he says on page 44, I'd like to paraphrase the Peter principle, the idea that in every organization, people rise to the level of their incompetence. He says, I'd like to paraphrase it. I think what actually happens is that in every organization, everyone rises to the level at which they become paralyzed with fear. And the essence of leadership is to be aware of your fear and seeing it in the people you wish to lead. It won't go away, but the awareness is the key to making progress. And he's exactly right. I mean, he talks about elsewhere. I've heard him talk about this on a podcast, Brian Koppelman's podcast, where he talks about going into a coffee shop in say Los Angeles, and you see a bunch of people out there who are typing along on their laptops, and they'll say, I'm an aspiring screenwriter. And for some of them, if you come up and say, well, let me see your screenplay, let me look at it, they don't want that. And why? It's because there's a fear that they would rather have in their mind the idea that they're a great screenwriter that nobody has recognized yet than to actually, as he puts it, ship the work where they might not be, and they might have to take criticism. And that happens with everybody. That's the reason why a lot of people in ministry start out as people who actually have an authentic voice and something to bring to the table and end up being hacks, just playing to whatever it is that the crowd wants, whether that's in sort of slick kind of marketing based Christianity or in some forms of angry, demagogic sorts of religion. All of that is based in fear, and it's protecting the self from fear. And he talks about in this book, when you choose to lead, you're going to be under huge pressure to reconsider your choice, to compromise, to dumb it down, or to give up. And of course, because the world's job is to get you to be quiet and to follow, the status quo is the status quo for a reason. So when I read Tribes, what I think about is Elijah and the Apostle Paul, and Elijah standing alone in order that he could speak to the remnant. The Apostle Paul in Galatians 1 and 2, so not yielding to the crowd so that, as he says, the gospel would be preserved for you. He talks about in this book, Linchpin, about how the people who prize their relevance are the people who ultimately lose it because they tailor their message to whatever the crowd wants. But what we need are the people who are the truth tellers in the room, not the truth tellers in the sense of the sort of people, I've got my opinion, you're going to hear it, I don't care if you like it or those sorts of people are categorized as quarrelsome in Scripture. But the people who authentically see the truth, gently, with kindness, speak to it and seek to lead people toward it, even when they come under criticism. And what that means is you have to have a different sort of audience in your mind Because if everybody is your audience, then you're not going to have an audience. So he says things like this: if you seek out critics, bureaucrats, gatekeepers, form fillers, and by the book bosses when you're looking for feedback, should you be surprised that you end up doing the things that please them? They have the attitude that there is an endless line of cogs just like you, and you better fit in, bow down, and do what you're told, or they'll just go with the next person in line. And this is important. Without your consent, they can't hold on to the status quo, can't make you miserable, can't maintain their hold on power over you. It's up to you. And he says you can spend your time on stage pleasing the heckler in the back, or you can devote it to the audience that came to hear you perform. I think that's exactly right. I mean, how many people are seeking to carry out their ministries, and because, like the Muppet Show, there's the two old guys in the balcony yelling, "This is awful." They just freeze and they don't do anything at all. That's exactly what Godin is talking about in these books, and he talks about what it means to not seek to. In one of these books, he quotes the musician John Mayer talking about that he had a gambling addiction with other people's opinions of him, and that's probably especially a temptation now with social media, where people can, if you go on it and you're actually looking at that stuff, you can start to live your life on the basis of what random people's opinions are of you, including a lot of people who you wouldn't go to them for advice or counsel on anything, but all they're doing is putting you in fear of them, and you start to sort of freeze. Another one that I like is called the Icarus Deception, where he talks about the same sort of thing, but in a lot more detail. And he says this: you are not your art. When the criticism rolls in, when the project is turned down, or when your sales call is rejected, it's easy, automatic, human, likely, to assume that you have been rejected. After all, when the project is embraced, it feels like you're being embraced. And so rejection must mean precisely the flip side, that they hate you because they hate your work. But that's artistic suicide, he says here. I would say ministry suicide as well. It's not useful to put yourself on the line, life or death, do or die, because you are not your product. The only way to be vulnerable, which is how you actually create something, and go to the edge, is to realize that if your art doesn't work, that you'll be back tomorrow with more better art. That doesn't just apply to artists, that really applies to everybody. So there's a lot of really good material in Seth Godin. I recommend these books. Also recommend, if you want to sort of see whether or not this is somebody for you, go to Brian Koppelman's podcast, The Moment, and listen to some of the interviews that he does with Godin, or check out some of his videos on YouTube. Let me know in the comments what books or writers you would like for us to talk about here on Reading in Exile, and I'll see you next time.